this to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office. Experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
for insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all. In-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths.
We hold these truths.
With Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Welcome back, everybody. We've got a great episode ahead of us. We are going to talk about what it really means to make China pay, if that is indeed our goal. At this point, it's pretty obvious that the Chinese have lied. They ensured that the world had many less weeks to plan and deal with the coronavirus than would have been desired. And in the coming months, we've even seen propaganda against the U.S. saying that it was our fault that the coronavirus spread, among many other forms of propaganda. So to help us along with this conversation and outlining the future of what it means to deal with China and make them pay for this, we're going to have with us a columnist, author, and lawyer with extensive knowledge of China, Gordon Chang. Gordon, thanks so much for being on the show.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Congressman.
So your work has appeared in all the major news papers and journals. You've lived and worked in China and Hong Kong for almost 2 decades. You're a graduate of the Cornell Law School, and you're author of the book, The Coming Collapse of China. So you seem like a pretty good guy to have this conversation with. What's your general take? I mean, give us just a quick summary of what's true and what isn't with how China reacted to the virus. How much of that was incompetence and how much of it was malevolence in dealing with this and regarding the information they chose to share with the world?
Yeah, there was a share of both incompetence and malevolence. China knew about the coronavirus at least December 8th, and that is the day that the World Health Organization said that the first patient in China was diagnosed. But there are reports that Beijing knew about this earlier. Doctors in Wuhan, which is the epicenter, probably knew by the second week in December that there was not only a new disease, but it could be transmitted person to person. Yet Beijing didn't tell the world about this, didn't publicly acknowledge it until January 20. And during that time, Congressman, Beijing tried to maintain that there was no human-to-human transmission possible. So what occurred is that during at least a six-week period, and probably a lot longer, this disease spread throughout China, but it also left China's borders and spread around the world. We've got to be concerned. On
that human-human contact, I remember that lie being spread by the World Health Organization. They were basically repeating the Chinese Communist Party's lies in as late as mid-January. And there's no way they thought that was true. I mean, what happened there? What is China's influence in the World Health Organization?
Yeah. January 14th, there was a tweet from the WHO which repeated that China has said that there is no evidence of human-to-human transmission. And that probably led some countries to not take the precautions that were necessary. China has worked very hard to control the WHO. So, for instance, the previous Director General, Margaret Chan, was a Chinese national. And the current Director General, Dr. Tedros, is someone who is very sympathetic to Chinese communism. So there is a concerted effort on the part of Beijing to actually populate multilateral organizations, but especially WHO. And that's why WHO has parroted Beijing's lines and has put out propaganda which is really dangerous. So, for instance, WHO, following Beijing's line, tried to get countries not to impose travel restrictions on China. And that effort spread the virus beyond China's borders, clearly to South Korea, certainly to Iran and Italy. And those 3 societies were crippled by the novel coronavirus. So we can see that China's control over the WHO led to the spread of this disease. And indeed, the WHO took actions that would inevitably result in a pandemic.
Everybody's talking about making China pay, but what I haven't heard is holding the WHO accountable. Is there is there a need to do that, considering what you're saying? I mean, it seems like they did more harm than good in this worldwide pandemic.
Yes, they did more harm than good. And, we've just started to talk about some of the things that the WHO did. There's a lot more. We could hold the WHO accountable. We should. They don't have any assets. So it really would just be a question of changing the leadership of the WHO. There's certain things, the technical things that the WHO does, which are good. But the political leadership of WHO, and it's not just Tedros, the Director General, who is very much under Beijing's thumb. It's also the number two, Bruce Aylward. And so there's a whole group of people at the top of this organization that need to be cleaned out.
Yeah, that seems obvious in hindsight, and maybe you're right. Maybe that is what it means to make them pay, is to simply change out the leadership. We would like to hope that there's still some value in a multilateral organization like the WHO that can step back and look at worldwide pandemics holistically, but they completely and utterly failed us this time, and in fact it seems that they're the cause of many lives lost. So back to China though. So as they incompetently dealt with the virus, they let 5 million people travel outside of Wuhan province. And then we all know the propaganda that's taken place since, whether perpetuating our domestic progressive talking points about the Chinese, calling it the Chinese virus is racist, whether they started that or we started it. I don't know. I just know that the CCP perpetuated it. Whether it was saying that U.S. Army personnel in Wuhan spread the virus, which was absurd on its face, or a number of other claims. I guess what else should we be concerned about? Because right now everybody's very we don't believe the numbers coming out of China, that they've gotten the virus under control, that the number of cases is as small as it is in such an enormous country, 1.5 billion people. So how can we figure out what's really going on in China, and what should we believe and what shouldn't we?
It's very difficult to understand what's going on now because Xi Jinping has imposed extraordinary controls on information. Beijing is basically saying that all of the cases that China has are imported, and that's people coming from the outside into China. And they will admit to about 2 cases of community transition inside China, but from people who came from the outside. So it's either imported or from people who it came into China. That's unlikely for a number of reasons. First of all, what we have been able to observe, the disease could not have gone to zero so fast. It's also inconsistent with the modeling from virologists and epidemiologists. And it's inconsistent with things that we've been able to observe in the last 3 or 4 days. So, for instance, at the end of last week, Beijing closed all the theaters in China nationwide, even though they were just open for a week, because they had been opened a week before. They were closed again. Also, Global Times, which is Communist Party tabloid, reported yesterday that tourist attractions in Shanghai and Chengdu were closed. And we are seeing that the nationwide college exam, has been postponed from June to early July. Beijing has not rescheduled the annual meeting of the National People's Congress, which was scheduled for the end of the first week in March. That is important because that's all of China's leadership attends that, as well as another meeting, which are held together called the 2 sessions. Until those are rescheduled, we know that China is still suffering from the coronavirus. So just from the behavior of the regime, we can tell that the disease is still infecting people in the country.
Right. And what do you say to a lot of people who are wondering how much conspiracy is behind this entire thing, that China did some of this deliberately? I think some people point to some statistics that, and again, I don't put a whole lot of credibility in these theories, but I just want to get your take on it. That, Wuhan province had a certain number of cases, but many other provinces didn't. And how was that even possible? considering other countries were so devastated. Are they just not telling us the number of cases, or is it possible that the Chinese sort of meticulously allowed this to be spread while planning ahead within their own country?
There's a lot of conspiracy theories, and many of them are propagated by Chinese people themselves. It is almost impossible that Wuhan has the majority of cases. There just has to be large outbreaks in other places as well. So, when China says that almost all the cases were in the city of Wuhan or surrounding Hubei province, that just does not make sense. And also, there's a lot of other stuff that is being propagated out there. But this disease, we have got a very good view of this disease because we've seen it in Italy, Spain, South Korea, Iran, and of course our country as well. So we know how the COVID-19 virus works, and it can't work in one way outside of China and another way inside China.
Right.
That is just extremely, extremely improbable.
Yeah. Well, some of our conspiracy theorists point out or would suggest that this was a human-designed virus that either got out either by accident or on purpose. Is there any chance of that? Do you see that even being remotely feasible?
It is unlikely that this bug was engineered. There have been a few science papers that have talked about splicing. But people who have looked at this virus, and we've seen it, of course, because it's been spreading outside China, have basically come to the view that this naturally mutated. That doesn't answer the next question that people talk about, and that is, where did this bug come from? People talk about the wet market in Wuhan, and there's science that supports that, but there's also science that's inconsistent with that. And that leads us to the other theory, and that this was an accidental release from the China's P4 biosafety lab, which is also in Wuhan, 20 miles south of that wet market. We know that they have stored, as they have previously claimed, 1,500 types of viruses. We know that we're pretty sure that they have been experimenting with viruses there, but we don't know for sure. But Congressman, the one thing we know, and we're positive about this because we have seen this, and that is Beijing has prevented the foreign community from adequately studying Wuhan. And so until we have access to that P4 lab, until virologists and epidemiologists can go around Wuhan and study this, we have to say that, most theories are still open right now as to this virus.
Yeah, I mean, that's extremely suspicious, and that suspicion is further strengthened by the fact that very recently we saw reports that many tests being provided by China, as they sort of try to become the hero of the global pandemic, they released it upon the world, whether intentionally or not, and then try to become the hero and the savior to many countries. But then a lot of these tests apparently had to be sent back. They didn't function, or the masks, even PPE was not up to standard. How do you even account for that? The question I have is this stuff done on purpose, or is it incompetence?
In terms of the bad diagnostic kits and the substandard protective equipment, I think that's not done on purpose. That really is just a reflection of China's poor quality of manufacturing. We got to remember that China's main facility for making N95 masks is actually a 3M plant in China, and they do good stuff. But to ramp production up, what Beijing has done is it's had other factories manufacture this equipment. And so that has been, I think, largely responsible. We've seen a lot of defective equipment and products come from China over the course of decades. It's the result of an unaccountable political system that clothes itself in secrecy and is deeply corrupt. So that's what happens. So I don't think that this is really the result of defectiveness. And we got to remember that the CDC in our country initially sent out diagnostic kits, which were defective as well and had to be recalled. Right. But nonetheless, you can see that the system that we have, which is open, which is transparent, which is adversarial, we have a free press. So this doesn't happen as much in our society as in theirs.
Well, since you mentioned the free press, I think I must ask, what are your thoughts on how our media has really been adversarial enough against Chinese propaganda, while being maybe overly adversarial against our own government? What are your thoughts on that, generally speaking?
Yeah, this is really distressing, because China is attacking our society, and this attack is fundamental, and it poses an existential challenge to us. And I can understand people don't like President Trump. They won't vote for him in November. That's fine. But we got to remember that we've only got one president right now, and he's the only person who can protect us from a common enemy that puts our republic at risk. So we Americans have need to unite behind President Trump, because we don't have a choice if we want to keep our society together. And I think that media has been, in general, pretty poor in discussing the context with connection to a number of controversies. So, for instance, this whole thing about President Trump using the term Chinese virus. And of course, the vice president and the secretary of state have used similar terms. And we're getting a whole bunch of complaints that this is racist. Well, I'm Chinese American, and I don't find it racist at all. I'm very happy that our president, vice president, and secretary of state are doing this because they're defending us. We've got to remember that the Chinese Foreign Ministry, from about the end of the first week in February, has been engaged in a relentless campaign with the Communist Party in tarring America over disease issues. And that culminated on the 12th of this month when you had a foreign ministry spokesman, as you mentioned, said that patient zero was in the United States and that the U.S. Army spread the virus to Wuhan, which is grossly irresponsible and highly inflammatory and very dangerous, because what the Chinese are doing are laying out the groundwork for retaliation against the U.S. The media needs to put that context in when they talk about the terms that President Trump used to describe the virus, because President Trump was saying, no, this virus is not American. It didn't come from America. We didn't spread it to Wuhan. This is a virus that started in China.
Yeah, not to mention this is just the terminology we use for all viruses. They're generally based on some kind of geographic origin. I mean, on its face, it's absurd. And I've been talking about this a lot recently. The political opportunism has got to stop, and because these aren't the last hard decisions we have to make, and we're going to have to make hard decisions about how to reopen our society in a responsible way. And the easiest thing in the world will be to take petty partisan sniper shots at people, no matter what they do. And it's just wholly detrimental to the conversation. Yeah, I mean, the media is almost, it actually feels like it's getting worse every day, though. They're happy to praise Chinese efforts abroad while continuing to bash ours. And I just don't understand that kind of adversarial relationship against our own American leaders while praising the Chinese Communist Party. It is an odd thing to witness. So go ahead.
If I could give you just one more example, because everyone's talked about the labeling of the virus, but there's something else which is even more important. And that is, on January 31st, President Trump imposed travel restrictions and quarantines on China. And President Trump took a lot of incoming, not only from Beijing, but also from domestic critics.
Right.
That is the most important decision that Trump has made, and he made the right decision. Because we got to remember that China, even though they knew that there was human-to-human transmission, they wanted countries not to impose these restrictions. They wanted free arrivals from China. And they knew in Beijing that this would spread the disease, or they had to know. So what President Trump did was protect the U.S. at a critical time. The media should have understood this and put that into the context of what Beijing was doing, but they didn't, and that's a failing. And we got to remember that, China itself, about a month later, started imposing travel restrictions on foreigners coming to China. So clearly, this was an attempt by Beijing to cripple other societies. They knew how crippled their society was. They wanted this disease to spread around the world, I think, to even the playing field. If that was not their intention, well, let me put it this way, that I can't speak to what Xi Jinping, the Chinese ruler, was in fact thinking, but if he wanted to maliciously spread the virus to other societies, he would have done exactly what he did do. And thank God for President Trump imposing those travel restrictions and protecting America from this virus, which came from China.
Yeah, and that's a step taken when nobody else was looking at this virus, right? Everybody was looking at impeachment. State governors, mayors were not preparing for this virus. We're not thinking about it. I remember when President Trump asked Congress for $2.5 billion extra dollars to begin fighting the virus or begin refunding a lot of our public health services that had been dwindled by some of the expenses. And Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats all of a sudden woke up to this. But instead of actually focusing on the virus, they directed their sights on President Trump and said that he was a fool for not asking for more, which he responded, "Okay, give me more then." Like, that's not really the issue. I remember very specifically what we passed in Congress that week, and it was not a bill. It was not an appropriations bill. It was a bill to ban flavored tobacco. So, I mean, the hypocrisy on this it almost feels like parody, frankly, from a Democrat Republican standpoint. The other thing I would point out is the Chinese don't even have to do propaganda anymore. They really don't have to. I mean, all they have to do is boost whatever Trump's political opponents say. Trump's political opponents come up with way better propaganda against our country than the Chinese ever could. And that's why before I asked, I wasn't sure if it was the Chinese that came up with the notion that the China virus is racist or the progressive left. Because I'm not so sure the Chinese are that creative, but all they have to do is just parrot what they say. It's interesting to hear you say. I mean, we're not sure whether they intentionally did this or not, or whether it was just blatant incompetence and then malevolent steps to cover for their incompetence that allowed this to spread globally. But in any case, whether it's either one of those, whether it's incompetence or purposeful malintent. There is this growing movement, and a rightful one, I think, to make them pay for that. Senator Cotton has talked extensively about that. Senator Josh Hawley has talked extensively about that, about a potential international investigation into China. I mean, my question to you is how, reasonably, what does that mean? How do we actually make them pay?
Well, China has substantial assets abroad in many currencies, especially the dollar. And many people have been saying that in terms of reparations, that we just seize China's holdings in treasuries and in dollars, which we can do. I'm concerned that if we do that, Beijing and its allies, especially Russia, will launch just a relentless assault on the United States, accusing us of being irresponsible stewards of the global financial system. So what I think that we should do is work with those other countries that issue currencies that are widely held. And that would include Great Britain, the European Union, Switzerland, and Japan. If all of us were to act together, and that's not inconceivable, but if all of us were to act together, then Beijing can't criticize the U.S. for this, and we would actually have a remedy that would hurt China. It wouldn't compensate us for all of our losses. We can't do that. Americans have died, and the economic losses are just staggering, well in excess of what China holds in dollars. But nonetheless, we need to make a point. We need to establish the principle, because I do think that China's spreading of the disease was malicious. And there are a few things that we can do in concert with others that would be effective remedies.
And I think if I were to read between the lines on Senator Hawley's desire to investigate it, I think the key finding of our investigation, or the key purpose of it, would be to find out how intentional this was. Because I think that does matter in the conversation about making them pay. So that's an idea on say freezing some of their assets. Is there anything other? I mean, just going forward, is it going to be business as usual? Because the reality is we already have an adversarial relationship with China. that President Trump has, I think, rightfully recognized as a necessity going forward. More of an economic rivalry than anything else. Of course, there's always going to be a military rivalry, but it seems that China, they're in their minds, in their grand strategy, their goal is to compete against the United States economically first and in the harshest ways possible, and then build up capacity eventually to compete with us militarily. So I guess does this really change that? Because we already knew that was happening and we needed to confront it.
It doesn't change it, but what it does do is it makes China's malign intent much more obvious. As the Chinese would say, there's a saying that roughly translates as, the fox has shown its tail. And that's what's happened here. People who have followed Beijing closely would not be surprised by most of what China has done. But nonetheless, it's being, I think, brought home to a lot of people who aren't day-to-day China watchers. So in that sense, I think it is not going to be as business going forward as usual after the virus subsides. And we are going to have more robust policies, especially if President Trump is reelected.
Yeah, and I think we should. Is there anything else you would add as far as concrete steps we could take?
I think that what we're going to have to do before we have any confidence that China has taken care of this is to continue restrictions on travel between the United States and China. And we may even have to have a more rigorous inspection for products, because our CDC has said that this virus can last on inanimate surfaces for 17 days. And that has all sorts of implications in terms of what we do in terms of accepting cargo from China. I actually think that because China has been so malign, that what we have to do is to start doing some of those things that were discussed before, but actually were not implemented. So, for instance, we need to stop selling semiconductors to Huawei Technologies, which is the China's telecom equipment manufacturer, and which is controlled by the Communist Party. We also have to go forward with the executive order that Peter Navarro, the president's trade advisor, has talked about, and that is an order making sure that we manufacture critical pharmaceuticals in the United States inside our borders, because we're way too reliant on China. We shouldn't be reliant on any country to the extent that we are, but certainly not a hostile regime. You just go down the list of things that we should have been doing up to now. I think that we'll probably dust off that list and start thinking about these in a more determined way.
Right. I mean, and we certainly have that list, and I think the origin of that list was more along the lines of a rejuvenation of American manufacturing and American self-reliance, which I think is a good conversation to have. But it's still hard to have when without a tipping point. But there really is a tipping point now. And it sort of gives us the excuse, like as you're saying, to dust off that list of items and really move forward with it, because it's good for our national security. It's good for our economy, and it does change the conversation, especially amongst conservatives who have long held to a more of a free trade approach. But I think what President Trump has really brought to the forefront is this conversation about the value of domestic manufacturing. Even if our cost of labor is higher and it makes a good cost a little bit more, we can't ignore the value of those manufacturing jobs and what it means to be able to manufacture things here in the United States. It's more getting on the economic side and broader strategic side of things, but it really is related to how we move forward against China.
So, yeah, everyone talks about the cheap goods from China, but we got to remember that we have paid recently in lives of Americans and an economic cost that is staggering, which we measure in the trillions of dollars of lost production. And that lost production is probably going to continue for quite some time, because this virus is not done with us. So when we talk about cheap Chinese goods, that cost just went up to a point where we cannot pay it.
Right. Well, that's absolutely true. You've predicted a few times that the Chinese Communist Party is about to collapse. I think your book came out in 2001, the collapse of China, or the coming collapse of China. And so I guess my question is, why do you think it's on the verge of collapse, but why hasn't it collapsed yet?
Yeah. In 2001, I wrote a book where I said it took 10 years for the Communist Party to fail. And there are a lot of reasons why it didn't. But one of them was the 2008 global downturn, which gave China a lease of life in which really strengthened the regime. I think China right now is fragile. And we're seeing that because China looks like it's lashing out at us. And so that's a real indication of problems. There's internal dissension at the top of the Communist Party. And we know that because of its gross mishandling of the coronavirus epidemic, the Chinese people are now nationwide talking about fundamental political reform. So, for instance, they've adopted as their anthem, "Do You Hear the People Sing?" which is that politically impactful song from Les Miserables, which the people in Hong Kong have adopted as their anthem as a protest against communist China. The thing, though, that has changed for China is the economy. It wasn't growing very fast, if it was growing at all, before the epidemic. We know that it is severe contraction right now, and the question is, can they come out of that? And if they can't, that is a immediate and existential crisis for the party. They've got a lot of problems internally, like debt, but the one problem that is well beyond their control is that their principal export markets, the United States and Europe, are just flat on their backs and are not going to be ordering a lot of Chinese products. And so that means it's going to be very hard for China to get out of a economic crisis, which is largely of their own making, but which now has been aggravated by the lack of external demand.
Yeah. And if you, for that reason, it seems to be a stretch for me that they would purposefully unleash a virus on other countries that they have to know that economic devastation in Europe and the United States terribly affects them. Maybe they're just willing to take the pain, kind of like the Russians are willing to take some pain right now on oil profits just to hurt us and our Texas gas industry. I don't know. These are interesting questions. So you mentioned Hong Kong. I think one of the things we know that the Chinese Communist Party is most afraid of is their own people. They have good reason to be afraid of the citizens of Hong Kong. Citizens of Hong Kong had breathed freedom for a while, and then it was slowly taken away from them, and they'd had enough. What about the rest of China? Is there ever a chance that we see widespread protests? Is there ever a chance that they finally wake up to their situation and do something about it? Is there a tipping point that it can occur, or is that collectivist mentality so deeply imbued in them that it's this that we can't understand it with our Western minds? What do you think about that?
Yeah, they've got a different perspective, but nonetheless, we can see from the history of the People's Republic that every so often the Chinese people take to the streets. And of course, that happened in 1989, where it was not just Beijing, but also in about 370 other cities. That occurred in the 1950s. So it could very well occur again, and especially when we talk about the economy. If they can't engineer an economic revival fast, party's got a problem because it has made the continual delivery of prosperity the primary basis of its legitimacy. So anything can happen. I know that Xi Jinping is trying to strengthen the Communist Party at a time of disease, and he might be successful. But he's also got some real challenges which he can't deal with, which is, as I mentioned, a questioning of the party's rule, because people do want fundamental change. So this is sort of one of those to be continued stories, but you can see there are elements, or I could say that the elements for fundamental change are in place. Whether it happens now or whether it happens 5 years from now, we don't know. But the Chinese people themselves talk about their own Chernobyl in reference to the nuclear disaster in Ukraine in 1986, which within 5 years led to the dissolution of the Soviet Communist Party.
So what do you think the next steps that China takes? Are they going to use the crisis to continue to assert and take advantage of global markets somehow? Mm-hmm. Are they going to continue to make moves in the South China Sea while we're not as vigilant? What do you think is next for them?
Probably all of the above. We know that they have been more provocative over the last couple of weeks in the South China Sea. We know that they have been ramping up the tempo of provocations with Taiwan, both in on the surface of the sea and in the air. And they've also surged their forces through international straits between Japanese islands, the Miyako Strait, for instance. So that's got to be a concern about this increased tempo of belligerent activity on the part of the People's Liberation Army. And it's going to take the United States to be clear, and perhaps in public as well as in private, to deter China from untoward action at this time of disease. We've got two of our aircraft carriers in the Western Pacific are now hobbled by the coronavirus, the Ronald Reagan and the Theodore Roosevelt. And so China may think that it has the opportunity to do something while we don't have the capability to counter it. So this is a very precarious time for us.
Yeah, and it behooves us to be vigilant and keep track of these things. Absolutely, up in Washington, and I think we will. I think we are up to the task. Gordon, I really appreciate you being on the show. Is there last thing, anything you want to add?
I think that just in general that we Americans need to understand that there is this attack on our society by China. China has shown how malign and belligerent it can be. And we've got to just keep together because right now we do have a common enemy.
Yeah, we absolutely do. We have to keep talking about it. Like you and I discussed, our press seems so reluctant to point this obvious truth out, and it's purely out of political hatred for the president. I don't see any other reason, and this would not be the time for that kind of nonsense. This would be the time to get behind him, and because as imperfect as every decision is that we make as a country. It is based on good intentions, and it is based on the right thing for the American people. It's easy to say, snipe from the sidelines and argue counterfactuals that can't be disproven. But it's that kind of politics has no place in right now. And I would hope that they would save it for the election time instead of right now. But we'll see. We'll see, and I think we're capable. I think we're perfectly capable as a country of moving past this and in a clear-headed, clear-eyed way, and focusing on our real adversaries as opposed to the internal domestic disputes we have. But we just got to come together and do it. All right, Gordon, thanks so much for being on the show. How can people follow you, whether on Twitter or social media, website, anything?
Yeah, my website is www.gordonchang.com, and Twitter handle is Gordon G. Chang, GordonGchang.
All right. Well, there you have it, everybody. Follow Gordon Chang for all the latest and most insightful commentary and analysis on the Chinese issue. Thanks, Gordon.